I'm sure some of you on here are familiar with Naked and Afraid, the show. Well, I recently binged the XL series. Basically, naked people go out into the wilderness and try to survive with very little in the way of tools. They get to bring one item each. Sometimes they get a pot for boiling water. Most people bring machetes, fire starters, or mosquito nets, and everything else must be acquired in the wild. It sounds ridiculous, and maybe some of it is fake. I really don't know. But it's also addictive. I mean, these people are stark naked, no shoes, no nothing. But then they go out there and build shelters, collect resources, and many contestants make it all the way to the end. Sometimes that's 40 days, sometimes it's 60. Either way, it's insane. It's one of those things that makes you think, gosh, I wonder if I could do that. Well, spoiler alert, I could not. I only wanted to try for a weekend just for fun, just to see what it was like. When I got a nice secluded spot in the woods, I stripped down just like in the show. Then I took 3 steps and decided to put my shoes back on. The ground was covered in stickers, rocks, painful roots. There was just no way. When I went to sit down, the reality of what it meant to have my naked bits touching the ground set in, and I put my pants back on. At that point, it felt ridiculous to walk around topless, so I decided it was unnecessary to emulate every part of the show. Once my clothes were back on, I decided to get water from a nearby creek. It looked absolutely disgusting, even after I boiled it. There was no way that I was going to put that into my body. None. Luckily, I brought emergency bottled water and drank that instead. What's one more concession? The real challenge would be building a shelter and finding food. Now, I went into this knowing I wasn't going to kill some poor animal just so that I could pretend I was on a reality show. But there are plenty of fruits and berries in the area I visited. Theoretically, food should have been the easy part. It wasn't. I got lost. But Alicia, your phone has GPS. Yes, but I was playing a stupid game, so I left my phone at the campsite. That's how smart I am. I had been to that area before, but never ventured quite so far. Nothing looked familiar. I didn't leave any kind of trail to follow back. I kept thinking that I would find food just around the next bend, and then suddenly I was miles away from my campsite. Eventually I saw a building through the tree line and wept with joy. I had no flashlight, so I was going to be a whole different kind of screwed once it got dark. I ran to the clearing and found an old church building with a small graveyard behind it. I was very disheartened to learn that there were no people around. I searched inside the chapel and found nothing of use, just a few short rows of pews. In the daylight, it was a picturesque setting, like something out of a rustic painting, but I had a feeling that wouldn't be the case in an hour. I was relieved to see that there was a dirt road I could possibly follow to some sort of civilization. But alas, that too was a bust. I walked as far as I could, but the sun was working against me. I had to choose between going back to the church and sheltering for the night, or continuing down an unknown road into total darkness. I chose the church. By the time I made it back, the sun had completely set. The only light came from a small, starry patch in the overcast sky. The church was almost pitch black inside, so all I could do was feel for a pew and lay down. The hardwood hurt my back and my ass instantly. The thought of sleeping till morning was the only thing keeping me calm, and now that was gone too. I cried like a child. I was full on sobbing, having one of those what the fuck is wrong with me moments. I do that kind of shit all the time. I think something looks fun, so I dive in 100% without an ounce of research, and then I screw myself over. Every single time. After a few minutes, I thought my sobs were echoing. It sounded like a second person had started crying outside, but when I stopped, it stopped. The first time I thought that I was losing my mind, but after it happened a second and third time, I was sure. I wasn't hearing myself. This was from an entirely different person. I felt my way to the door and called out. No one answered, but something took a few steps closer in my direction. That's when the fear set in. There wasn't even starlight to see by. It was just black. I hadn't thought about the reasons someone would be sneaking around in the dark. It wasn't very likely that someone else just so happened to get lost on the same night, also without a flashlight. I didn't know what to do. I stood there frozen. I'm not sure for how long, probably only a minute or two. But then the crying suddenly started again. It was loud and mournful. It sounded like the source was standing right next to me. Imagine someone is crying on your shoulder. It was exactly that. I reached out for whoever it was. I felt like if I could just get my hands on them, they would have to explain themselves or kill me. Either way, I had to know what I was dealing with. I couldn't handle the uncertainty, but I only grabbed air. I swear I reached through the sound. There's no way I didn't at least brush against someone standing that close. Then I remembered the graveyard, and I got really scared. My dumbass not only got lost in the woods, I got stranded in a haunted church. Who the fuck does that? I ran back inside, slammed the door behind me, like it would actually help if a ghost were chasing me. I sat down right against the door and I didn't move for a long time. Once the crying stopped, it didn't start again, and I was finally able to calm down a little. Eventually, I decided to feel my way back to the pew, but when my hand found one, it felt wrong. The arms were standard pew arms, smooth wood with slight curves like you'd see in any church. As I probed further, I realized something was on top of the arm and lifted it with both hands, trying to get a feel for what it could be. I really don't know how to describe it outside of saying exactly what I think it was. It was a skeletal hand, 4 fingers, a thumb, a goddamn hand. Not a living one, of course. Whatever I held was definitely dead. When I pulled, it was like pulling on a body, and it fell toward me. I let go and jumped back, expecting to hear it hit the ground. But there was no sound at all. I wasn't brave enough to go feeling around again, so I made my way back to the door, leaned against it until there was enough sunlight to hit the road. It was absolutely the longest night of my life. Sometimes the floors would creak or there would be a sound outside, but nothing seemed to get close to me. When there was finally enough light to see my surroundings, I could confirm there was no skeleton present in the chapel, nor anything else that I could have mistaken for one. It seems like a completely normal church, and outside there was a peaceful little cemetery. No trace of the previous horrors in sight. I ended up walking down the road for over an hour before a nice old lady stopped and asked if I needed help. She took me back to my campsite where I promptly packed my things and got the hell out of there.
Moans by the Prowler. It was a beautiful late summer's day. The weather had finally started to cool as fall approached, and Sam wanted to take advantage of it. He figured the best way to go about that was a short camping trip. It was already midday, so he quickly gathered the essential supplies needed for at least a day of camping and was off to the store for the rest of the important supplies. He was in a rush. Sam was quickly losing light and wanted to find a place to camp before it got dark. Usually, being the experienced camper that he is, his trips are planned in advance. Every supply and every detail exact. Also, letting friends and loved ones know where he's going to be, just in case of an emergency. This being a spur-of-the-moment decision, and him being in such a rush, trying to get everything, and trying to get there, and have everything set up before the sunset, he wasn't able to call anyone to let them know where he was going to be. It completely slipped his mind. When he did finally think of it, he was in line at the store, trying to check out. He knew it was important, but told himself he could do it when he got settled at the campsite. For how late in the day it was when he made his decision to go, He still made great time and got everything set up and was all settled in before the sunset. After setting up the tent and getting the fire started, he laid back and rested his head against a log he had placed down the last time he was here and stared up at the sky, watching the sun set over the mountains. He was at peace. This was his favorite spot. He had been here so many times before, it was like a second home to him. And nobody knew about this place but him. It was secluded, just off the main hiking trail. When the sun completely set behind the mountaintops, and it was dark, Sam was ready for dinner. He brought out the cast iron skillet and placed it on top of the simmering coals and cooked up a couple of steaks. He also remembered to call a few people to let them know where he was, but he couldn't get through to anyone. There was no signal. He laughed it off and said to himself, "It's no big deal. I'm only staying overnight. What's the worst that could happen?" He then finished cooking the steaks and couldn't wait to dig in. They smelled delicious, and at this point he was starving. He sat by the fire and enjoyed the meal he had cooked, savoring every bite that he took. "The best steak I have ever cooked," he thought. The wind began to pick up as he enjoyed his meal, that hollow, eerie, peaceful sound that the wind makes, heard in the distance. He closed his eyes and relaxed, enjoying the last bites of his meal. He thought he heard something off in the distance, however. Probably an animal, or maybe it was the wind playing tricks with his ears. He wasn't alarmed. It couldn't be anything other than those two things. And I'm not afraid of those two things, he thought. A rifle, which he had brought for protection, will put a person's mind at ease after all. He then cleaned up after himself, the utensils and the skillet, whistling as he did so. Still, though, he swore he could hear sounds off in the distance. When he finished cleaning, he laid back down by the fire and stared up at the starry night sky. The wind really picking up at this point. Sam thought it was peaceful and made him relax even more. He felt himself beginning to doze off, but was awoken by a moaning sound in the distance. He sat up and looked around, but saw nothing. Now, while, yes, he thought it was a strange sound, it could have easily just been a hurt animal. At least that's what he told himself. He was not worried at all, however. He had the rifle, remember? He decided it was time for bed and got up and headed inside the tent. He fell asleep right when his head hit the pillow. It had been a long, hectic day, but ended in his favorite place to relax. He had been asleep maybe an hour when he was awoken again by moans off in the distance. They were ominous, and as he sat up, it sounded as if they were getting closer. The wind was at full-blown howl at this point, but the moans were cutting through it like a knife. These were no animal sounds that he had ever heard of before. He was starting to get a little nervous at this point. The moans were getting louder, and they were getting closer. Sam grabbed his rifle and placed it in his lap. The wind seemed to have picked up even more and had begun to shake the tent a little. Still, through the sound of the leaves blowing violently in the wind, the sounds of moaning were getting closer. It sounded like someone was dying. Long, painful moans, like they were moments away from death. Now, the moaning sounded like it was at the log by the campfire. Sam quickly readied the rifle in a firing position and screamed out, "Don't come any closer! I have a gun!" It was silent. The moaning had stopped. All that could be heard was the hollow wind blowing around him. A few moments pass. Still silence. Sam has his rifle fixed at the opening of the tent. when right outside the tent, right next to his ear, a soft, deathly moan moans his name. He screams out and the tent begins to rattle and shake. Loud moans now ring all around him. They are deafening. They keep moaning his name. He's screaming for them to stop, for them to leave or he'll shoot. All of a sudden, the opening of the tent begins to unzip. Then a loud, ominous moan screams out.
"You're mine."
Sam screams, "No! Get away!" And a gunshot rings out into the night. When the sun rose the next morning, the sounds of birds chirping and the soft, gentle breeze that blew through the leaves could be heard as the park rangers came upon the campsite. There was a report of shots fired by some campers who were camped not far from where Sam was camped overnight. Sam's campsite was so secluded, however, and not in a designated camping area, the rangers only found it from the smoke billowing from the embers of the now dying fire. The rangers made their presence known and asked for the occupants of the tent to come out, but they got no response. Then one of the rangers reached for the zipper and unzipped the opening to the tent. They couldn't believe their eyes. The entire inside of the tent was covered in blood, and a broken rifle laid in the back left corner. There was no signs of a struggle, no rips or tears in the tent, and no footprints around the campsite. It seemed as if no one had been here at all. The only signs of Sam were his belongings. I met him at the Crossroads. Deleted author. Hello, my name is John, and I'm 28 years old. A little over a year ago, my wife and I both visited separate doctors. She came back home and told me she was pregnant. It was one of the happiest moments of my life. Too bad the same day, my doctor had informed me that I had pancreatic cancer. The cancer treatment wasn't helping. It felt like the more my son started to grow in my wife's tummy, the more I decayed and withered away. I would cry at night, thinking about how my son would grow up without a father. My wife always told me not to talk that way. She told me to stay positive, but I knew I didn't have long. The thought of my wife being left alone with our son, or worse, her remarrying, and a stranger takes care of our son, I couldn't bear it. I went to church every Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday. I grew up in the church. My dad was a preacher when he was alive. I prayed constantly, prayed for God to heal my pancreatic cancer, but nothing would change. Each morning I would wake up sicker and sicker. I knew I had to do something. That's why I met him at the Crossroads. I'm from the South, Kentucky. I've always heard about the devil. I've always been warned about him, about how he's evil and whatever. I'll admit I was afraid of him, but I was more afraid of being away from my family. I had heard growing up that you can meet the devil at night, at the crossroads, by the woods. So I gathered up all the strength I had and drove to the old country roads of Henry County. And there it was. 2 gravel roads intersected by the woods. The only source of light was the flickering street lamp that was swarmed with insects. I parked my car and waited. The wait seemed like an eternity. I almost felt like leaving, but I could tell he was coming. My heart fell into my stomach. I began to cold sweat. My muscles tensed up. My skin turned pale. A car drove up. The loud music blaring from the car made my ears vibrate. It even shook his car. His car was black, with red and orange flames painted all around. His tires lit up in all different colors. The car drove past me, slinging gravel all on my clothes. Then he parked. The music stopped. The lights on the wheels turned off, and he opened the door. He was the most beautiful man I had ever seen. Short, light brown hair that flowed in the wind, bright blue eyes that were piercing to look at, pure white teeth. He was wearing a suit, like he had just left a business meeting, and he walked with a suitcase. As he began to move towards me, he chuckled. "Well, don't just stand there like an idiot. We don't have all night. I have places to go, people to see." I stood there speechless. I couldn't believe he actually was there. "I know why you're here. I can smell your sorrow from miles away." He took a big sniff of the air around us. "But there's another smell coming from you. One I even like more." He leaned in real close. "Desperation," he whispered. Finally, I gathered up the courage to speak. "I want to make a deal with you," I mumbled. He looked at me and smiled. "Well, of course you do. And what is this deal?" My voice shook. "I want to give you my soul, and in return, you give me a long life, a life where I can watch my son grow up. I want you to take my cancer away." He looked pensive. He thought for a while. It must have been a whole minute before he broke the silence. "Deal." He reached into his suitcase and pulled out a dagger. The symbols on the blade made my heart sink. It made it feel real. There was no turning back. He took the dagger and made a gash in his hand. Blood started to pour from his palm. He handed me the dagger. "Your turn," he told me. I did the same thing as him. I cut my palm. It burned, like my hand was on fire. After I returned the dagger, he held out his hand. We shook hands, our blood intermingling. His grip was tight, and his blood felt boiling. I could see in his eyes the most unspeakable things. I saw men and women screaming in agony. I saw war, destruction, chaos. I saw pain and suffering. I saw fire, so much fire. His grin made my heart pound. He let go. "Pleasure doing business with you," he said. He walked back to his car. The music turned back on. The wheels lit up, and he drove away. I can admit, only minutes after our handshake, I already started to feel better. My wife never questioned where I was that night. I am the luckiest man in the world, because I got to see the birth of my son. I got to hold him, rock him to sleep. My life was finally back on track. I have only one person to thank. Thank you, Lucifer. Thank you for saving my life. I saw something in the woods. Unknown author. I live in Oklahoma. The Native Americans here tell stories of the creatures here. Little people, stikinis, etc. There is a place in Sasakwa, Oklahoma, called Bird Creek Church. My friend's grandma said that stikinis were all around that place. Stikinis are shapeshifters and are really scared off by the natives where I live. They shift into the form of an owl. You don't speak their name out loud, or at night they will come and find you. They are vicious creatures, a sign of death. So one weekend, my friends and I wanted an adventure. We went to the church. We heard things speaking and screeching in the woods. It's the woods, so we don't think anything of it. We keep walking deeper into the woods. I keep asking my friends if they feel okay. They don't. I don't either, because we know we shouldn't be there. One sign of us needing to leave was that all our phones were dying at the same time. I had a flashlight, so we stayed. This last sign is one we will never forget, and the reason we will never go back. We got to a place about a third of a mile behind the church. There were rocks, big ones. Behind one, I could see a large figure crouching down. It was breathing heavily. I don't know why, but I asked it if it was okay, and it looked at me and got up. That thing was 8 feet tall. It had wings and a huge open mouth. It started chasing us. We bolted all the way back to the car. We got back to the car, and it was gone. But my friend's back was hurting. We didn't check until we got home. He had teeth marks on his back. We told his grandma about what had happened. She scolded us for going and told us all to put blessed tobacco under our beds and around the outside of our houses. That was to keep them out. The people in Oklahoma can be scary, but always watch out for the woods. Things tend to lead you there. The Witch in the Woods by the Prowler. My grandfather always sat us around the fireplace and told us about his childhood and the small New England village he grew up in. He would always regale us of his adventures with he and his friends throughout the village and the surrounding woods. But there was one story that we haven't forgotten to this day, and never will. Now, this particular tale, my grandfather and his friends were playing in the deep woods surrounding their village. My grandfather said he began to notice that they were getting to a part of the woods they've never been before, but didn't get too concerned because him and his friends were having such a great time, and the woods were just so beautiful. It was fall, you see, and he said the colors of the leaves were simply mesmerizing. The bright reds, yellows, and oranges popped from every tree branch. The deeper he and his friends got, it seemed they were more and more entranced by the beautiful colors. The air was cool and crisp. There was a sweet aroma wafting from the distance, almost encircling them. Faster and faster they went, jumping and laughing. Around and around they played, moving and shouting, spinning and spinning. Just then they stopped, and when they did, they just stood there in awe. In the distance, there stood a cabin, long and dark, with a big black tree that stood over the cabin next to the far window of the dilapidated cottage. It looked eerie, especially surrounded by the other trees in the forest. It had no leaves, and it was dark as a cold winter's night. The children stood there looking at the cabin with their jaws dropped. They didn't even know anyone lived out this far into the woods. Their parents never mentioned it, and no one in town ever talked about a person living in the woods. As my grandfather and his friends began to discuss what they were looking at, the front door of the cabin swung open. Out walked a slender older woman with long black hair with silver streaks throughout, holding a basket of breads and pastries. That was the sweet smell the boys had smelled earlier. My grandfather said she looked eerie. Something about her seemed off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something spooky about the old woman. As he stared at her, she looked up and noticed the boys looking at her. She smiled an evil smile. Then she spoke to them. "Hello, boys. What are you doing over there? Why don't you come in? I have many tasty goodies inside. Cupcakes, pastries, candies, even ice cream." My grandfather and his friends looked at each other in amazement. They've never seen so many foods all at once. They walked toward the front of the cabin as she smiled at each one as they entered. My grandfather stopped in his tracks. It felt like he was being dragged into that cabin by the smells of the food, and every time she opened her mouth, it felt like he was being dragged closer and closer to the front door. Just then he saw a rock, picked it up, and hurled it towards her head, hitting her right between the eyes. Her concentration was interrupted, and he turned and ran away, running non-stop all the way into town, telling anyone who would listen what had happened. Most of the men in the village and the families of the friends followed him back to the dark old cabin in the woods. But to my grandfather's dismay, the old cabin wasn't there. Just the old black oak tree that stood over it, and next to it on the ground sat a basket of delicious treats. Needless to say, my grandfather's friends were never heard from again, and my grandfather and his family were forced to leave the village. So if you ever come across a dark cabin in the woods under a black oak tree, and you start smelling delicious treats in the air, stop, turn around, and if anyone is with you, make sure they stay right by your side, because you've just encountered a witch, and she's hungry for you. Don't follow the whistling. Author unknown. As a kid growing up in Louisiana, I spent a lot of time in the woods, hunting, fishing, just standard things. There's lots of legends and tales of these woods, a lot of which come from my grandfather. Once I got old enough to travel the woods alone, he started telling me of these legends. Petey Peepon was one of them. I was old enough to believe that the story of Petey Peepon was just something he made up to mess with me. It sounded pretty ridiculous after all. He told me if I ever heard a whistling out in the woods, not to follow it, or Petey Peepon would take me away. Standard ghost story stuff. Early one morning, before the sun had risen, I was out in the woods. I was sitting on a log, waiting for the sun to come up so I could begin my squirrel hunt, listening for any sign of tree branches moving or acorns hitting the ground. It can be pretty peaceful. I used to live for those moments. The cool early morning air, the silence of the woods. It's a fantastic experience. Once the sun had come up, for me to see without the help of a light, I stood up and started to really survey the area, deciding on which direction I would go. I wasn't worried about staying close to the camp. At the time I was 14, and my dad had instilled upon me basic survival instincts. I knew to keep in mind what direction the sun was to me when I started walking, and to put it to the opposite side when I returned. Depending on the time of day, of course. I had never gotten lost by doing just that. After walking a good 5 miles, stopping to bag a few squirrels along the way, I came across a small clearing and decided to rest for a minute. The woods had gotten silent, so I guessed that since nothing was moving, it would be best to stop and wait for signs of squirrels. I first heard the whistle from my right. It wasn't a whistle someone does when they're trying to get your attention, more like someone whistling a song. What kind of idiot is walking around whistling when people are trying to hunt? I heard the whistling coming closer, and I could tell whoever this was coming right where I was sitting. Out in the woods, we don't like to yell at each other, so we just make this whooping noise. It's kind of the universal "I'm over here" signal. Whoop! I was hoping that whoever was coming my way would take the hint and either leave or stop whistling. At least whoop back to me. However, they did not. I couldn't hear them coming any closer, but they just kept whistling. I stand up from my log and look in the direction of the whistling. I couldn't see anyone there. Putting it off as someone who spent way too much on fancy camouflage, I decided to yell out, "Hey, I'm trying to hunt over here." Still, the whistling keeps going. Getting very irritated, I started walking towards the whistling so I could tell this idiot to shut up. I walked a good 500 yards and never saw anyone. I stopped to scratch my head and wonder if I was going crazy when I heard the whistling again, this time behind me. Now I'm thinking it's my cousin messing with me. He was next to me the night my grandfather was telling me about the things in the woods, and he knew my hunting spot. I walked back that direction saying, "Rhett, if that's you, I swear to God I'm gonna kill you." I wasn't worried about hunting anymore. I just wanted to know who was messing with me. I get back to where the clearing was, and it wasn't there. It's like the trees just magically grew back, and I was more confused than I had ever been in my life. Whistling from my right this time. At this point, I realize I have no idea where I am. Nothing looks right anymore. If I didn't know any better, I'd say that someone moved all the trees around when I walked away. By that time, I realized that I needed to get out of there. My stomach sank when I realized that, at this time, the sun was in the middle of the sky. I had no way of knowing which way to go. I felt confused and extremely lost. I could hear the whistling coming from behind me again. I started walking in the opposite direction of the whistling, hoping I could get away from whatever was causing it. I walked about 5 minutes when the whistling started coming from in front of me and was getting closer. I remembered I had a gun and stood my ground. I didn't see any other way of getting out of there. I saw only what I can describe as a blurry figure walking towards me. When I say blurry, I mean that it was like my eyes just refused to focus on whatever this thing was walking towards me. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, nothing helped. It was just a black, blurry blob in the form of a human. I fired at it and heard this horrible screech, something I can only describe as microphone feedback, but so loud I thought my eardrums were going to burst. I took off running and just didn't stop. I managed to find a deer trail and started following it. Things started to look familiar at that point, and I started seeing used shotgun shells on the ground. They looked like mine, and when I realized that, I remembered where I was. I followed the deer trail back to the camp, where my dad and Grandpa was. When my dad saw me, he started screaming at me, asking where I was and why I hadn't came back to the camp. I asked him what he meant. I had only been gone a few hours, and why were they back so early? I never came back to the camp that night. I had been gone for almost a full day. I decided not to tell them about what happened, mostly because I knew there was no way my dad would believe me. I made up a story that I had gotten lost and just camped out in the woods that night. I wasn't allowed to hunt alone for a while. That night, as we're sitting around the fire, my dad left to answer nature's call, and my grandpa said, "You followed the whistling, didn't you?" I would like to give a heartfelt thank you to the special friends of the channel for your overwhelming generosity. If you would like to support the channel, the link is below in the description. Also, please send me your stories and poems to duchessofdarkness27@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram at duchess.ofdarkness and Twitter at duchessofdark and 2. I want to thank all my listeners for your kindness, your encouragement, and your support. It means the world to me. Thank you for joining me. Until next time.